In this episode, we investigate the stories of three people whose forced journeys determine the course of their lives and those of their ancestors.
I'm making the same journey as my own great-great-grandmother 150 years ago.
From the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean, they reveal a hidden world of exploitation and survival.
Just looking into the faces on those photos, that really got me.
Our travelers uncover their own direct links to slavery and how it was shaped by religion, racism, and greed. Karen Gibson is the conductor of the London-based Kingdom Choir. They performed at the wedding of Prince Harry and Meghan Markle. She grew up in London, the daughter of Guyanese parents, and has been called Britain's godmother of gospel. Karen is traveling to Lisbon to find out more about the extraordinary life of Joseph Emedy, a talented 18th century African musician. His enslavement led him on a 6,000-mile journey to the Portuguese capital via Latin America.
The history of this Negro musician, Emedy, is too remarkable to be passed over in silence. He was born in Guinea, on the west coast of Africa, sold into slavery to some Portuguese traders, taken by them to the Brazils when quite a boy.
I think we can't talk about the history of slavery without talking about South America. The vast majority of people who were enslaved and taken from their homelands were brought to Brazil. What really needs to happen is this broader viewpoint that looks at slavery's role in making the modern world. South America becomes a deeply, deeply important part of that system of enslavement.
Too young for heavy work, Emedy was probably enslaved in a wealthy household in Rio. He showed a talent for music, and when his master returned to Portugal, he took Emedy with him.
He manifested such a love for music that he was supplied with a violin and a teacher, and in the course of 3 or 4 years, he became sufficiently proficient to be admitted as one of the second violins in the orchestra of the opera at Lisbon. It's amazing to think that at the age of 16, Emedy ends up here at the Lisbon Opera House. I mean, what a journey. It beggars belief, really. How do you make that transition? How do you go through that trauma and that adversity and still achieve that level of success? It's absolutely incredible.
Karen is meeting Professor Rodriguez King Dorset to get an insight into Emedy's extraordinary rise as a musician.
How did Emedy come to be playing second violin at the Royal Opera House in Lisbon?
I think it was very unusual. But I think that Emedy's talent was such that his former master would look and say, if they teach him the rudiments of the violin and the flute, for instance, he then becomes a skillful fashion item. So there's a bit of a one-upmanship for the masters and the mistress to show him off. And remember, at this point, he is technically a free man. The moment he stepped foot in Lisbon, he's a free man.
Why do you say that?
Because when he's in Brazil, he's a slave. In 1761, in Portugal, slavery was abolished.
Emedy may have been technically free, but his freedoms would have been limited, and he still had to sing for his supper.
It's assumed that Black people have more musical ability. And that's partly because the people who could, that's how they were visible in white society, and that's how they ate.
Black folk can do everything. It's simple as that, we can. But it's not seen or accepted that we can. They can be absolutely brilliant, but they mustn't get above their station.
There is so much that has been lost because of the inhumanity of slavery. Millions of people who were lost aboard ship. Culture is what helps us reclaim them.
As a youngster, I myself played classical music. I played the piano and the oboe, and I would say that it gave me a sense of purpose, it gave me identity. And I wonder if it was the same for the young Emily at 16 years old. I wonder if music was an escape or gave him a sense of solace.
Slavery may have been abolished in Portugal, but the slave trade was still thriving all over the world. Africans continued to be transported across the Atlantic, but also across the Indian Ocean from East Africa. Coming up, Trisha Goddard discovers the cruel fate of children enslaved in East Africa.
They were just taken from one kind of slavery to another.
And Rachel Johnson uncovers her own family's connection to a very different form of slavery.
Women were traded like any other commodity here in Venice, you know, silk or spices.
Venice, jewel of the Renaissance, prosperous, sophisticated, yet beneath the refinement lurks a dark and surprising history.
This is an absolutely beautiful city, but Venice is built on the sweat of thousands of slaves who've been trafficked into this city.
The gateway between East and Western Europe, Venice became a leading naval power for centuries and relied on maritime trade for its survival. Writer Rachel Johnson, sister of Prime Minister Boris Johnson, has come to Venice to discover the truth about her family's story. A story which reveals her great-great-grandmother was a victim of a form of slavery, very different from what was taking place thousands of miles away in the New World.
I feel actually quite stunned by it. I really do.
Venice was at the center of a very peculiar type of slave trade in the Renaissance. Whilst Venice was the place you would go to buy rare brocades and Middle Eastern silks, Venice is also the place where you buy someone that can stitch them into clothes.
Until the 9th century, Venetian merchants were engaged in a thriving trade, indiscriminately selling captive men and women to Islamic nations. But in 840 AD, a treaty outlawed the sale of Christians to Muslims. Venetian traders began to look east to fill the demand, selecting captives not by race, but by religion. Ships docked and unloaded their cargo along today's Riva Schiavoni, shore of the Slavs. The word slave derives from Slav.
I had this childish binary idea that it was all slaves trafficked from Africa to the New World.
Some of the enslaved were sold to wealthy Venetians. They became valuable assets and were treated accordingly.
The overwhelming majority of people who came here as slaves were coming from the Black Sea area. And so they were Russian, Tartar, Circassians. When they came here, they were converted to Christianity. So they were assimilated to the family, especially with women, became very intimate.
You weren't chained, you didn't have to go and break boulders in the field.
No, they must be protected during their lifetime because they had a huge value. And so it means a good health, a good treatment.
Apparently chow is etymologically to do with slavery.
Yeah, it's a Venetian word, schiavo in Venetian, schiavo in Italian. It was a very polite way to say hello at that time, to say that I'm your slave.
In Venice in the 1400s, slaves were important as a status symbol. A major staple of luxury would have been a Circassian slave. The Circassians, white Muslims from today's southern Russia, were highly prized as luxury workers.
Rachel's great-great-grandmother came from Circassia and was sold by her own family as a girl.
I'm seeing this city in a very, very different light now. Women were a commodity. They were traded like any other commodity here in Venice, you know, silk or spices.
To find out what life might have been like for her great-great-grandmother, Rachel has come to the Venice State Archive. It holds records of enslaved people traded here.
Questo è proprio un atto notarile stilato a Venezia nel luglio del 1433, in cui vediamo una compravendita di una schiava circassa. Le schiave venivano adibite per i lavori domestici. Una schiava di bella presenza era quasi sempre destinata anche a diventare un oggetto sessuale. O, se nella sua fortuna, una concubina con poi prole, e i figli potevano quasi anche essere poi legittimati o comunque essere tenuti in grande considerazione.
This was one of the crucial differences between slavery in medieval Venice and the forms of slavery that developed in the New World, in which the children of enslaved women were born into enslavement. In 876 AD, a law was introduced in Venice that banned all slave trading, but the law was flouted.
Era più conveniente continuare a commerciare gli schiavi e pagare la multa, il gioco è fatto.
The profits from slavery were so great that it was worth paying the penalty for if you were caught.
Sì.
Even though it was officially banned, the city was so addicted to the luxury, the leisure and pleasure of having slaves that slavery carried on for the next 500 years.
The victims of Venetian slavery were people of different races. Skin color did not mark a person out as free or enslaved. As a result, the descendants of Venetian slaves, unlike the descendants of enslaved Africans, have not had to face the centuries of racism and discrimination. That history of the trafficking of Africans into slavery began far further back in time than many people realize, and not in the Atlantic, but on the other side of the African continent.
The Indian Ocean slave trade is probably the oldest of the slave trades and transported more human beings, and it was multi-directional.
Exports of the enslaved from the Indian Ocean to the Muslim world grew exponentially after Arab traders won control of the Swahili coast and sea routes in the 8th century. The trafficking of millions of human beings from Africa's east coast led to the emergence of African diaspora communities, like the Shidi in Pakistan and India, and Afro-Iraqis in Basra.
Islamic law does not permit slave trading. Many Muslims throughout the Indian Ocean world ignored those rules. And so they plundered and captured Africans, Indians, Southeast Asians, usually non-Muslims.
Both Christianity and Islam asserted the value of a person as created by God. Yet both religions accepted the capture, sale, and ownership of men, women, and children from Africa. The Atlantic trade to the west centered on labor and shipped at least 2 men for every woman. The Indian Ocean trade to the east centered on services and included soldiers, cooks, and concubines. It shipped roughly 2 women for every man. The key location was in modern-day Tanzania, the island of Zanzibar, under control of the Omani Arab Empire from the 17th century. For 200 years, it specialized in 3 things: ivory, spices, and slaves. British TV journalist Trisha Goddard moved to East Africa with her family in the 60s before returning to England at the age of 9.
I spent a few years of my childhood in Tanzania, and I've got to say they were the happiest years of my childhood. It was the beginning of the 1960s. Tanzania was newly formed. My father wanted to go and help a newly formed African state.
In 1807, Britain finally turned its back on the slave trade. Royal Navy warships were dispatched to the Atlantic to suppress the slave trades of other nations. Some of the Africans freed from slavery were resettled in Freetown in Sierra Leone. Others were sent to work in the West Indies. Over the course of the 19th century, thousands of British sailors died intercepting foreign slave ships. And the mission to end the slave trade led the Royal Navy into the Indian Ocean and into direct conflict with the slave traders of Zanzibar. Now living in the US, Tricia has come to Greenwich, Connecticut to find out more about the history of the slave trade through Zanzibar. Professor Bernard Freeman is a leading expert on slavery in the Indian Ocean. He has a rare series of 19th century photographs taken by the British Royal Navy.
So what's that, Bernard?
Well, this is a photo that's taken on the deck of a British naval ship called the London. And this is probably taken somewhere near Zanzibar. All of these black people in the center of the photo are rescued slaves. And as you see...
They're children. There's so many
it's
children.
mostly children and boys and girls and some teenage boys as well.
Under pressure from the British, the slave trade was banned in Zanzibar in 1873 by Sultan Bargash bin Said, but unofficially, slavery continued.
After Bargash abolished the slave trade between Zanzibar and the mainland, an illegal trade sprung up, and the British Navy instituted a patrol. The Royal Navy paid a bounty for the capture of a slave ship.
Oh.
So the sailors got cash for capturing the slave boat.
Bernard has a newspaper article from the Anti-Slavery Reporter, published in London in 1877. It shows what life was like for the enslaved freed by the Royal Navy.
Most people don't know this. Instead of being repatriated with their families and in their villages in East Africa, they were sent to labor camps.
But would families, if there were families, would they be kept together?
Probably not. Some of it was based on demand. Who needed workers? And so oftentimes they would be shipped to the Seychelles, to South Africa, to Mauritius, which had big sugar plantations. It's really not much different, or it could even be worse than slavery. So instead of getting a wage at the end of the month, the liberated African would get a bill for the food, for the housing, for the medical care. And so you would never work off that debt.
They were just basically taken from one kind of slavery to another.
That's correct.
Just looking into the faces on those photos, that really got me. It's just the inhumanity. I'm still trying to find out about my own ancestry. My mother came from the island of Dominica. One of my loved ones could be many of those faces on any ship, in any photo. It's a really sobering and scary thought.
The enslavement of Africans, taken as a whole, over hundreds of years, changed the world. It changed our language, it changed the demographics of the world, and it took this idea of race, based on something as meaningless as skin color, and it created this fissure, this divide, this fracture that still shapes the world today. We are living and navigating in the ruins of the empire of slavery.
Having learnt of Emidy's emancipation and musical career in Lisbon, Karen Gibson now wants to find out what happened next. She is retracing Emidy's footsteps on the night he lost his freedom for the second time.
Emedy has just finished giving one of those magnificent performances that he's been known for.
Yes.
He would have packed his violin and he would have made his way out this exit stage door. Unbeknown to Emedy, there was a ship that was anchored just 300 yards down the road there. Captain Pellew, who was in charge of that ship, and two of his lieutenants decided that they needed a fiddler for their ship, and Emedy was their man. So as soon as Emedy came out of the door, one of them would have knocked him out and then bundled him on the ship, and then for the next 4 years, he was their fiddler. They had got their man.
So essentially he was kidnapped?
He was kidnapped.
At any time during the day, you could have a bag thrown under your head and wake up on a ship to be sold back, and even when you did get free, you could be sold back into slavery. So you were constantly terrorized.
Slavery was meant to dehumanize, and only if you can get people in that frame of mind could you then make them do absolutely what you wanted them to do.
Poor Emedy was thus forced, against his will, to descend from the high regions of the music in which he delighted, Gluck, Haydn, Cimarosa, and Mozart, to desecrate his violin to hornpipes, jigs, and reels, which he loathed and detested.
As the months go by and the years go by, they would have broken his soul. The captain's duty is to keep up the morale of his crew. And Emedy was part of that. And if Emedy was not up to it, they would have, in no uncertain terms, have kicked his black ass with that violin.
I can't imagine what that must be like, to be able to have to give away over and over again the thing that you love and the thing that means something to you, to somebody who has no respect for you. This story of Emedy constantly brings me back to the story of my own family. My great-great-grandfather was also brought over from West Africa to Guyana as a slave. I'd love to know the story. I'd love to fill in the missing pieces. And maybe that's why this story of Emedy so resonates with me.
Next, Rachel Johnson travels to Istanbul to uncover more of her family history. And American TV host Shannon LaNier investigates a very personal connection to US President Thomas Jefferson.
He's the man who wrote that all men are created equal. Yet he's also the man who owned at least 600 people.
Rachel Johnson has come to Istanbul, once the capital of the Ottoman Empire, to search for the truth about her great-great-grandmother.
My name reflects my very mixed heritage. I've got Muslim, Christian, and Anglo-Saxon and Jewish grandparents. And Johnson is actually the name that we were given when my grandfather, who was half Turkish, naturalized. You know, my grandfather, he never talked about the fact he was Turkish. And I don't think it was much spoken of that my great-great-grandmother was a slave. That was a cause of shame and embarrassment. And he, of course, changed his name from Osman Ali to Wilfred Johnson. There can be no bigger statement of cleansing the past. I feel that if I find out about my great-great-grandmother, I will necessarily find out more about myself.
Like Venice, most slavery in the Ottoman Empire is a lot more niche, is about skills. So we're going to have prostitution, we're going to have accountants, we're going to have translators, we're going to have craftsmen.
Rachel believes her great-great-grandmother was sold in a market here in the mid-1800s, not by a slave trader, but by her own father.
So I've been told that somewhere around here, between the mosque and the Grand Bazaar, human flesh was traded alongside carpets, nuts, spices, silver, a baklava, you name it, as recently as 150 years ago, which blows my mind.
Captive men and women came from all over the empire. the North African Barbary states, allies of the Ottomans, enslaved people from all over Europe. But the most valued slaves came from the Black Sea, from where the Ottomans took roughly 2.5 million Circassians. Rachel is meeting her cousin, Sinan Kunaralp, a diplomatic historian and publisher, in the hope he can shine light on the life of their ancestor.
Our forefather, Hajj Ahmed, was a self-made man, basically, and his first wife died early. And so he applied to a middleman, saying that I'm in the market for a young, fairly nice, good-looking bride-to-be. There was a network of people who would provide brides from Circassia. It was a region famed for the beauty of their womenfolk, and it was a supply for the Istanbul harems, because they were tall, blonde, blue-eyed women with very forceful character. This gentleman, very fierce-looking, is Hanife's father, the man who sold his daughter. He's a tribesman, a warlord, a brigand. Hanife is here. This is one of her daughters.
There's a Johnson look.
Yes. Hajj Ahmed Hamdi would have been 43 when he married this 13-year-old.
13.
In today's context, it sounds completely unnatural, considering the conditions in the small villages of Circassia where existence was very threadbare and very frugal. Becoming the wife of a wealthy trader or merchant is definitely an improvement.
Were Hanife Frida's slave origins a source of pride or shame? Or maybe both?
Shame? Certainly not, because considering that the sultans were all sons of slave girls. Hanife went on to have 4 children. Her firstborn, your great-grandfather, Ali Kemal, who became a politician.
Minister for the Interior, which is the equivalent
in the Turkish context, Minister of Interior, the Home Secretary. And the...
So a very important man.
Absolutely.
"10 days in a boat crossing the Black Sea to meet a man she'd never met, 3 times her age, who she was going to have to marry. I mean, what a future, what a scary future for her. The loss of her family, of her homeland, of her own choice of husband, of choosing who to have your children with. These are the main things in a human being's life. And those were things that she never had.
In the Ottoman Empire, slavery was comparable to what you would see in many other countries around the world. However, there were some differences. One of the main differences was that as a slave, it was possible for a person to rise in power and esteem.
But in the colonies of North America, a different type of slavery had been emerging. Drawing on the brutal slave code of Barbados, enslaved Africans were legally defined as chattel or personal property, with no right to life or liberty. In Virginia in 1790, over 39% of those working in tobacco fields were enslaved. This was more than a decade after the US Declaration of Independence claimed all men are created equal.
It deliberately, purposefully, intentionally, and literally made human beings into objects, into commodities. It literally dehumanized them.
All right, let's go.
Shannon LaNier is one of America's most successful TV hosts. He's come with his family to Monticello in Virginia. This 5,000-acre plantation was home to US President Thomas Jefferson, who owned more than 600 slaves. When he was growing up, Shannon was told by his relatives that he was a descendant of an enslaved woman and the president himself.
So when I was in 2nd grade, I proudly stood up and told the entire class, Thomas Jefferson is my great-great-great-great-great-grandfather. And the teacher said, sit down and stop telling lies. Of course, the whole class laughed and I was devastated about it.
Jefferson's relationship with Sally Hemings, captured in this artist's impression, was denied for almost 2 centuries, until DNA evidence proved the link in 1998.
It's important that we don't push away our history and cherry pick what we want to tell. It'll help us understand our past, where we come from, and how to improve the future. Okay?
Shannon is meeting Professor Krista Dirkscheid, a Jefferson scholar at the University of Virginia. Shannon knows that Sally spent time with Jefferson in Paris, but he's not sure how that was possible when slavery was illegal there.
So I've got a document to show you, Shannon, that I think says a lot about your ancestors when they were brought by Jefferson to Paris. And I think you'll see there on the list of wages that Jefferson's paying people in his household. Do you recognize any names there?
I see Sally here, Sally Hemings, and her brother James Hemings.
Yep.
This is from 1788.
Yep. Sally Hemings had arrived for the first time in Paris, and we see that Jefferson is paying her and her brother wages, which would have been the first time that they're receiving money and income from Jefferson, their owner.
Now, why do you think he did that?
Well, because slavery was illegal in France at this time. So Jefferson didn't want to draw attention to the fact that he had human property within his household in Paris. So paying them was a way of making them look more like servants, I think.
Because he knew it was wrong.
Yes.
Paris in the 1780s was a bustling cosmopolitan city, a world away from the plantation state of Virginia, where Sally grew up. It was here that Hemings and Jefferson's relationship began.
I think these wage books really show us part of the kind of freedom and mobility that James and Sally Hemings would have experienced in Paris. Sally Hemings was learning French, so she was accompanying Jefferson's daughters out in Parisian society. Jefferson bought her very fine clothes, so she would have known that she was on free soil.
And I know it was there because she was free that her brother James wanted to stay in Paris, and he was like, "Stay with me, Sally, because we're free here." But she decided to come back with Thomas Jefferson. He promised her that however many children they had together, that he would free them at the age of 21 if she returned with him.
Yes, unlike other generations of enslaved women, she would break that cycle and her children would actually be free.
Well, that's one of the things that bothers me about Jefferson is that he knew slavery was wrong. He even tried to put it in the Declaration of Independence that, you know, the slaves should be freed, and yet he did nothing to help further it here at his plantation or anywhere else.
Krista is taking Shannon to Mulberry Row. Sally would probably have lived here when she returned to Virginia from France in 1789.
This long driveway was really the hub of industry on this enormous plantation.
I know a lot of the Hemings receives preferential treatment here on Monticello.
Part of the agreement is that she would be able to be with her children as they grew up. And this is so different than the vast majority of enslaved children at Monticello. in Virginia.
Thomas Jefferson fathered at least 6 children with Sally. 4 survived to adulthood. 2 were freed in Jefferson's lifetime, the other 2 when he died in 1826.
You know, a lot of people ask me about the relationship between Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings because it lasted over 38 years, and they like to romanticize it. It's definitely easier for some family members to not think of their great-grandmother being raped for 38 years, but I just don't think it could have been a love relationship based on the dynamics that she was, you know, 14, 15, 16 at the time, and she was a slave.
Sally Hemings was a teenage enslaved African-American girl. What bargaining power did she have? It was rape.
Thomas Jefferson, founding father, 3rd president of the United States, and author of the Declaration of Independence. He's the man who wrote that all men are created equal. Yet he's also the man who owned at least 600 people.
Next, Rachel Johnson finds out the value put on her great-great-grandmother.
I was really shocked that her life was really so cheap.
And Karen Gibson discovers what became of the twice enslaved violinist, Joseph Emedy.
After all he suffered, you know, he wins in the end.
In Istanbul, writer Rachel Johnson is tracing the history of her family's connection to slavery. She's meeting Hakan Erden, an expert on Ottoman slavery. She wants to find out what value would have been placed on an enslaved teenage girl.
So this is my great-great-grandmother as a middle-aged woman. She was sold, I think, when she was 15. Have you any idea how much she might have commanded in a marketplace?
Well, you know, the million-dollar question. Because after the Russians, when they defeated the Circassian Confederation in 1864, they emigrated to Ottoman Empire en masse, around 1.5 million. And about 10% were slaves. I have an article that appeared in New York Daily Times. There's an absolute glut in the market, and in former times, a good middling Circassian girl was sold very cheap at £100. But at the present moment, the same description of goods may be had for £5.
So, but her warlord father then was really not making a lot of money.
Probably he lived through dire straits and he was compelled to sell the daughter, but I'm sure he negotiated a good place for his daughter.
Because she married the very rich, wealthy trader of tallow candles. He had to, in a way, protect his daughter from poverty, starvation, God knows what, in Circassia. So the only option there was, really. I was really shocked when Hakan said that my ancestor was probably sold for very little money. And it made me feel sad that her life was really so cheap. I hesitate to say that being sold into slavery and having to marry an older man was a good thing, but it was the best available option to her. It's an incredible story, and I feel actually quite stunned by it. I really do.
Back in the UK, Karen Gibson has been doing more research into the life of Joseph Emedy, a talented African musician press-ganged aboard an English naval ship by Captain Pellew. After 4 years at sea, Emedy was finally able to leave the ship when it returned to England. It was 1799. He was 24. It didn't take long for his musical talent to shine through.
He first began by going out to parties to play the violin, which he did to a degree of perfection never before heard in Cornwall. This led to his being engaged as a teacher and then a leader at concerts so that by degrees he made rapid progress in reputation and means.
Emedy soon became known as a talented multi-instrumentalist and composer. He went on to lead a symphony orchestra, ironically in the same town where Captain Pellew was educated.
You may not have seen this before, but this is Truro Philharmonic Society, and there is Joseph Emedy himself, leading the orchestra.
I have not seen this. How good was Emedy's music that he wrote himself?
We can only guess, really, but probably the best clue we've got is a quote from Silk Buckingham, who said that given the right opportunities, Emedy could have been another Mendelssohn or another Beethoven. But his colleagues thought that Emedy's race would be against him.
Wow. Why do you think we don't have any copies of his music today?
It seems to me likely that at the time he was simply unappreciated. Probably when his wife died, then the music was just cleared out and bundled away. Very sad, but that's the situation we're left with.
Joseph Emedy's story only survives because it was documented by his friend, James Silk Buckingham. With no one to record them, the stories of millions of other enslaved people have been lost.
I feel, in some way, that in being able to retell Emedy's story is that I'm claiming something back. Not just for him, but for us all of the African diaspora whose ancestors had their freedom taken. Some whose names we will never know. Some whose stories, long ago, buried and forgotten. But I feel that every time we resurrect a story, we're telling all our stories. Here lie deposited the mortal remains of Mr. Joseph Antonia Emedy, who departed this life on the 23rd of April, 1835. He was a native of Portugal, which country he quitted about 40 years since, and pursuing the musical profession, resided in Cornwall until the close of his earthly career. They have described him as a native of Portugal. But he wasn't a native of Portugal. Actually, he was a native of Guinea. That's where he was born. I would hope that he found peace within himself. He was successful and he was happy and he lived a peaceful life. After all he suffered, you know, he wins in the end. That's what I feel.
When we think about figures like Joseph Emedy, we have to imagine that what they are fleeting glimpses of the human costs of the slave trade. A handful, tiny number of people who were the victims of slavery were able to find freedom, to find education, and then find the opportunity, critically, to express their talents and their abilities and their humanity. We think about them, and then we think about the millions whose lives were just consumed on plantations in America, in the Caribbean, in Brazil.
Next time, actor Ray Fearon discovers how the enslaved on some of those plantations rose up in rebellion and helped finally put an end to slavery.
They fought for their freedom, and I am here and a product of that freedom.
And the daughter of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. remembers how her father continued that fight for freedom and full racial equality.
My daddy was saying, we're gonna keep doing what we're doing because this is the right thing.